about inflammation, right? If we think about it, whatever you're dealing with, hypothyroid, psoriasis, diabetes, hypertension, Alzheimer's, cancer, chronic illness, autoimmunity, you name it, right? When we're talking about inflammation, I want you to start thinking it this way. Like, what if there was the same root cause for all of these chronic issues? Like, imagine a world where instead of treating each one of these diseases differently, there was a world where the things that you're doing to treat one of these illnesses actually improves the other illnesses as well. And for that to work, we have to think about, what if there was a common thread linking all of these conditions that seem not connected? Thyroid, psoriasis, diabetes, like they don't seem connected, right? So what is that common thread? And that common thread is inflammation. Now, when I talk about this, I really need you to understand this is not alternative medicine. This is not the stuff that you do instead of. This is about taking what we know about disease in conventional medicine and kicking it up a notch and actually taking it to a whole other level of understanding. Now, if you've been following me on social media or watching my lives, you'll know that I always talk about inflammation. That's because inflammation is literally the root cause of all the reasons you don't feel well. At the root of all disease is inflammation. Inflammation affects everything: your brain, your joints, your GI system, your nerves. Every part of your body is affected by inflammation. So whether you wake up every day dealing with one diagnosis or two diagnoses, or if you just don't feel good and have no diagnosis, the thing you need to be focusing on is inflammation. Now, as always, I like to tell you before I dive into inflammation, when you are watching this could be a few weeks later. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm also on the podcast. And if you don't already know, we also now have the TKM, the New Method membership. And you can join our community and get access to the whole method at an affordable price, and to even have an opportunity to suggest topics. It's really cool. So now you know how to reach me and my team. Now you know how to let us know that you're here and listening. Let's jump in. What is inflammation? So first things first, we have to talk about what inflammation is. Now, there are two kinds of inflammation. There's acute and there's chronic. Let's talk about acute. Acute means short term, right? Because inflammation is not a bad thing by itself. It's actually necessary. We can't stay alive without it. Inflammation is your body's natural defense mechanism against harm. Think of it like your body's security team. They go into action when there's a threat. When you have an unwanted intruder, a pathogen, a damaged cell, a harmful substance, right, that's coming at our door, inflammation comes in. It's the initial response by our immune system, right? So if you get a cut, you get hurt, the area gets swollen, that's inflammation. It's the body's response to heal your cells that got injured. When the cells are injured, damaged, or under attack, you release these chemicals. This happens on a molecular level, a cellular level, and it's like these chemicals, it's like calling 911 from cell to cell to cell, and the immune system reacts. And the immune system responds by sending all these other cells and proteins to handle the situation, create a barrier against spreading whatever this bad thing is. It lets your blood vessels expand, allows more blood to reach the area. It enables all these defensive white blood cells to reach the conflict area quickly. And this process is usually red and warm because these expanded blood cells are there. It's sometimes swollen because fluid's coming to the area. Pain is a byproduct of this inflammation because there's some pressure from the swelling. Also, there's a lot of chemicals that are released, like internal chemicals that are released. So, and sometimes even with inflammation, you have fever because that's your body's way of also responding. It turns up the heat to try to kill off pathogens. And that's why with acute inflammation, we see the redness, the heat, the swelling, the pain. We need that. We don't want that to go away. But sometimes inflammation can become chronic. This is the problem. It means it doesn't just heal the area and then stop. It just keeps going and going and going. And the body keeps producing these inflammatory cells, even when there's no obvious injury. Like you're in pain, but there's no cut. You didn't hit yourself. That's when the problem arises. The body is persistently and constantly in battle mode. And that's why you're constantly not feeling well, even when it feels like there's nothing going on, like what's happening. And that's why many of you are in a state of I-Don't-Feel-Good-Itis, because you're actually stuck on inflammation. Now, chronic inflammation, I'm going to explain this in a moment, but it creates disease because the body, instead of attacking a foreign object, instead of like just dealing with a pathogen and then getting back to what it needs to do, it starts attacking the healthy tissues, right? So rheumatoid arthritis, it's the autoimmune disease that is attacking the healthy joint issues when it's not supposed to be doing that. And over time, it can actually cause permanent damage. So inflammation can attack your joints, that's arthritis. It can attack your skin, that's psoriasis. It can attack your stomach, on and on and on. So inflammation just attacks and makes you feel unwell and can lead to disease. Then the disease itself that you now have causes inflammation, which leads to more issues. And that's like a chicken egg scenario, and you're stuck at this inflammatory loop. So how do you know if you have chronic inflammation? A lot of people want blood tests. And yes, you can run some blood tests sometimes. There are two markers that show inflammation. One is called CRP and the other one's called ESR. And if you're positive, then you are inflamed. But if you're negative, it doesn't mean you don't have inflammation. Okay, it just means that the blood markers didn't catch up yet. That's all it means. It's really important to listen to your symptoms. You don't always have to get that validation like, oh, if the CRP is negative, I'm not inflamed. No, if you have these symptoms, you're inflamed. If you're chronically exhausted, unexplained, ongoing fatigue, you went to your doctor, he or she said everything is fine, you don't have anemia, we don't know why you're fatigued, ongoing fatigue, inflammation. Some of you have these low-grade fevers. You keep going back, get checked, nothing's going on. Body pain, especially muscle and joint pain, skin issues, eczema, psoriasis. That's literally inflammation of the skin. Oh my God, anyone who has it knows that makes you crazy. Digestive problems. If you're the bloated person all the time, the GERD, the IBS, the IBD, that's inflammation. But mental symptoms are also inflammation. Brain fog, mood swings, depression, anxiety, right? All of that is inflammation. Whether or not you show elevated inflammatory markers, these are inflamed. Now, I need you to understand something. When we're talking about health, we have to understand it's a spectrum. Wellness on the one side, and you have illness on the other side, right? So I want you to imagine like an arrow on both sides. You have the illness, let's say, on the left, and wellness on the right. It's a spectrum. But you could be anywhere on that spectrum, right? And most of us are somewhere in the middle. We're not fully 100% optimized and well, and we're not fully 100% ill, or maybe we have one diagnosis or two, but some things are working. So most of us are in the middle, right? And what's happening in that middle? Chronic inflammation, right? That middle, that I don't feel good-itis, that I don't feel optimized, that's chronic inflammation time. That's the driver. That's what's taking you from the wellness to the illness, okay? So when you understand the disease process, you need to understand the inflammatory process behind it. What I wish that my providers, other providers would understand, my colleagues would understand, is that when your patient walks into your clinic already with a diagnosis, already with hypertension, already with diabetes, what we're seeing is not actually the disease. What you're seeing with that diagnosis is the end result of years of inflammation. And once you start seeing that it's not just the diabetes, what about the inflammation behind it? It's not just the hypothyroid. What about the inflammation behind it? So that you could start seeing that treating the end result is not enough. It doesn't make sense without treating the entire underlying driving cause. So it's critical for providers to start moving beyond symptom management, not instead of, but beyond, and start tackling the inflammation. Okay, so how does it work? Like, how, I get it, I'm inflamed, but like, how does inflammation turn into disease? Why is it that one person's inflammation gets a joint problem and another person's inflammation gets a skin problem? How does that make sense? It's inflammation. Why is one person going to joint, one person goes to the thyroid? Like, what's happening? So to understand that, you have to understand the progression of disease. So first and foremost, you have a genetic predisposition. Okay, they use some genes. Now, predisposition means that you have a likelihood of getting it. Different than the color of your eyes. That's not a predisposition. That's predetermined. Predisposition means you have a likelihood. So like grandma has diabetes, you have a likelihood of getting diabetes. But just because you have the genes for diabetes doesn't mean you will automatically get it. You still have to eat the sugar to activate those genes, to activate the disease, right? And so this is the same thing for many diseases. You have the genetic predisposition for arthritis, for psoriasis, for Hashimoto's. Then you have to be exposed to something. Now, what that thing is, we'll discuss in a moment. So you have the genetic predisposition, and you have to be exposed to something. And when you're exposed to that thing, that leads to years of inflammation. During that time, that's your time of I-Don't-Feel-Good-Itis. That's the time when you go from doctor to doctor and they say, you're fine. Why? Because you're on that spectrum. You're not ill yet. You don't have a diagnosis. You have this genetic predisposition, exposure, inflammation. I don't feel good. This is the time that will drive you crazy because you're actually in a state of pre-disease, you're pre-diagnosis. Then eventually you move on to the spectrum where the illness is and you get diagnosed with a disease, right? So you have genetic predisposition, exposure, years of inflammation, years of not feeling well, of I-Don't-Feel-Good-Itis, and then disease. Remember, when you see disease, when you actually have a diagnosis, you have to do a look back and say, what got us here? What caused the inflammation, right? How did this start? This is why when I do a one-on-one consult with my clients, I go back to birth. Like, they want to tell me what's going on now, and I get it, and then it's really important because they have to get that off their chest. But that's not enough. That's the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. What happened when you were a kid? What happened in your teenage years? What happened in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s? What's going on? This inflammation takes some time to build up. Disease comes after years of inflammation. The disease that you see, the diagnosis, is just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's just the visible manifestations of long-term inflammation. So what I'm saying so far, just to be super clear, is that inflammation causes disease. And your mission is to find the cause of the inflammation. Is it your nutrition? Is it your gut? Is it your stress? Is there a hidden infection? Right? We're going to go through the list. Until you find the source, you won't actually be able to reduce inflammation and truly manage your disease. Okay, so where does inflammation come from? Right? Because before we treat it, we have to know where it's coming from. So let's start with some obvious sources, then move on to like some lesser known sources. So first and foremost, we have our lifestyle choices. Okay, nutrition, the standard American diet, right? It's referred to as sad. It's so sad. It's so sad. If you're still eating standard American diet, please stop. Please stop. You're eating fire. You're eating fire. The diet is full of sugar, trans fat, processed food, all of which are pro-inflammatory. They create inflammation. The next lifestyle choice, lack of movement. Movement. I'm not even saying exercise, movement. A sedentary lifestyle just shows to increase inflammation. So if you're sitting all the time, even if you're working, you're trying to be productive, you're on Zoom, you're doing a podcast, that's still sedentary. You're still sitting. And that just by sitting causes inflammation. Sitting is the new smoking. Chronic stress, it creates inflammation, right? So because it releases these stress hormones. It releases a cascade of inflammation. It's telling your body, let's go, something's up. Lack of sleep or poor quality sleep increases inflammation. Smoking and alcohol both contribute to inflammation, right? So we have these lifestyle choices that are contributing to our inflammation. Then we have our belly, our gut microbiome. Like, if you watch me at all by now, you should already know about the microbiome. But a quick cliff note for anyone new. Hello, hi, welcome to the Vortex. You're in Crazy Town. You're welcome. Join us. That's awesome. So the microbiome is the billions of microscopic organisms that live inside of us. And we need to have a good balance of good and bad bacteria. When it's not balanced, we have inflammation. These bacteria produce things, right? They're not just sitting there, they're actually doing things. The good guys produce the things we need, and the bad guys produce the things that we don't want. So we need to create the perfect harmony in the city that lives inside our belly. And that is the only way to really get your health is on point. Now, how does that imbalance in the gut occur? Well, the lifestyle choices, right? If we're having like the standard American diet and all the stuff that we eat, but also overusing antibiotics, certain medications. So it's very easy to make a mess in the belly. And once we have this mess, this imbalance, it's called dysbiosis. Dysbiosis. And when you have this dysbiosis, you have inflammation, right? So we kind of know the lifestyle modification issues, lifestyle choices, and we know about microbiome. But let's talk about some lesser known sources of inflammation. Chronic infection. Now, you might say, I would know if I have an infection. Like, what do you mean? Like, I would know. It would be red. Wouldn't I have like a fever? No. Some infections can hang around for a really long time because your body's defense mechanism can't really get rid of it. And so now, but it's not super high. It's not causing you fever. It's not causing you, to be hospitalized. So it's this low level infection that you're walking around with that your body's constantly fighting, like Lyme, right? And yes, I know some of my colleagues don't believe in chronic Lyme. God bless you. That's awesome that you feel well and that you've never experienced it, but it's real. It's real. I don't need to convince you. It's okay. If that's not for you, it's not for you. But for my game changers, it's real, right? So then if you have a Lyme disease, you might say to yourself, okay, how does that exacerbate inflammation? So here's what happens. Your immune system is battling this bug. It's making those chemicals I told you about earlier, those cytokines and immune cells that result in inflammation, because inflammation is how it protects itself. Now, for a short-term infection, the flu, a cold, once the pathogen, the bug is gone, the inflammation goes away. But with chronic infection, because the bug isn't really gone, the inflammation sticks around, and that's not really good for your health, right? Because you're constantly inflamed. Now, there's more, right? Some bugs, like the one that causes Lyme disease, can actually play tricks on the immune system. They can hide. That's the trick with Lyme disease, is that the immune system, it's really, really smart in how it tricks the immune system, making it even harder for the immune system to find and destroy. This causes a never-ending cycle of inflammation, causing the fatigue, the aches, joint pain, the brain fog. Until you get rid of that Lyme, your source of inflammation never gets better. Those are the people that might say, I did the microbiome thing. I'm eating really well. I'm moving. I'm sleeping. I still don't feel well. That's when you start thinking about infection. Moving on, hormonal imbalance. If your hormones are off, you have chronic inflammation. Now, as soon as you say hormones, you think sex hormones. So hang tight before we get to sex hormones, okay? First of all, the thyroid. Hello, thyroid hormone. Thyroid, right here, small butterfly-shaped thing in your neck, and it makes thyroid hormones. These hormones control how your body uses everything, how it uses energy, how it manages your temperature. Sometimes your thyroid is not working right, and that leads to inflammation. Yeah, I have a whole video that talks about thyroid hormones, but you can have hypothyroid when your thyroid's really not producing, or hyperthyroid when it's overproducing. Both of them cause inflammation. Yes, we're going to talk also about sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone in women, testosterone in men. Yes, they play a big part in keeping you healthy. When they are in balance, they trigger more inflammation. And another hormone that we forget is a hormone sometimes is insulin. Insulin is something your body makes to keep your blood sugar steady. But sometimes your body can't use insulin well, right? It's in insulin resistance. There's a whole video on insulin resistance you should check out. But insulin resistance, again, creates a hormonal imbalance of insulin, and your body tries to fix it by making more insulin. This actually makes things worse. This higher level of insulin makes more cytokines, which increases inflammation, right? So another feedback loop that you're stuck in, just making inflammation worse and worse and worse. So we talked about infections. We talked about hormones. Another kind of culprit in inflammation is chronic mold exposure. And I did a whole video on that also, but here's like the quick thing on it. Mold is everywhere and everyone's fine. Most people are fine with it. Most people are like, whatever, I see mold, I'm fine. Good for you. That's awesome. It's true. Most people are fine because it's not inherently bad. The thing is that most people can eliminate it. They're exposed to it. They breathe it. Maybe they even eat it. And then they have the genes that makes it easy for them to eliminate. Awesome. Good for you. But for some people, they either don't have the gene to eliminate it, or they have too much of an exposure. Like it's too much for them. So maybe they could eliminate a little bit, but now they're in a really moldy place for many, many years. And over time, they don't realize it. They've been living in this house forever. The symptoms only started 2 years ago. That's because over time, they can't do it anymore, right? They can't eliminate it. They get overloaded. So now you have a person whose body is fighting every single day to eliminate the mold. And this battle causes inflammation. And that inflammation can cause disease, right? So like you have the mold or the Lyme or the belly causing inflammation. That inflammation now activates your Hashimoto's, activates your rheumatoid arthritis, activates wherever your genetic predisposition is. That's the issue. Another issue that causes inflammation is adrenal fatigue. Again, I did a whole video on this if you want to do a deep dive, but adrenal fatigue is a result of years of chronic stress. And eventually, your body can't handle it, runs out of steam, runs out of gas, becomes exhausted. That's called adrenal fatigue. And, when adrenal glands are fatigued, they can't produce the cortisol that you need. Remember, cortisol is a hormone, so it's kind of like a hormonal imbalance as well. And believe it or not, cortisol is actually anti-inflammatory. We need it. It calms things down, believe it or not. But now you're not making enough of it. So adrenal fatigue affects your immune system that way too. And it creates a state of inflammation. So you have this prolonged inflammation, which deteriorates your health. Now, of course, other than that, you have genes can play a huge part in chronic inflammation. Genetic variations can. And so there's in there and a family history as well. So you have all these things that can treat inflammation. So when you take a moment and you say, hey, I have Hashimoto's, and yes, of course, you should take the medication. I would never tell you not to take medication. But is it enough? Is it enough to just take the medication? Or do you now see, like, hey, if I don't treat the source of the inflammation to begin with, how the heck is my thyroid ever going to get better? The medication doesn't help the thyroid. The medication just gives you the hormone the thyroid can't make. So you're consistently exposed to mold or your belly's still a mess. What do you think is going to happen to that dosage of your thyroid medication? It's going to keep going up, right? You're getting the sense of what's happening here? Like the disease, the medication, important. You need it. It's not the fix though. It's just managing the problem. So how do we treat it? So we always start with the gut. right? I'm not saying that everything is just cured by the gut, but you have to start with the gut. Your gut is essentially your second brain, right? It's not just about the digestion and absorption of nutrients. It's a dynamic system that's tied into your immune response, and you're having an immune response. 70% of your immune system is in your gut. So what do you think is happening if there's fire in there, right? If there's inflammation in there. So we have to fix that first. How do we do that? Quick recap of how we do that. And of course, there's videos that go deeper into it, but 5R approach. Remove, replace, reinoculate, repair, rebalance. Okay, I didn't invent it, but I use it. Remove the inflammatory triggers, the standard American diet, the bad stuff. Also remove pathogens, like maybe you have H. pylori going on, like get rid of it, like figure out what's going on, get rid of it. Replace with digestive enzymes. Sometimes you need HCl, that's the acid that's in your belly. If you're one of those people who are bloated after you eat, you probably need some enzymes. After those two things, right, that's a good time to actually reinoculate, a good time to start probiotics and prebiotics. You could do it with food, you could do it with supplements. Probiotics are basically the bacteria that you need to kind of normalize that microbiome in your belly. So you need to have that. And the prebiotic is the food for the probiotics. Then we repair, which is healing the gut barrier, a healthy gut barrier. For if you want to watch the video on leaky gut, what's going on with the gut barrier. So you need a really strong, healthy gut lining to prevent inflammatory compounds from entering the bloodstream. So to repair, you're already repairing it because you're removing, you're replacing, you're reinoculating, but you also want to help with the lining. And you can do that again with the foods, but also L-glutamine, omega-3, zinc, vitamin A, vitamin D. When you consume L-glutamine real quick, it's an amino acid, helps repair the gut barrier by helping the intestinal cells. It reduces inflammation. Omega-3, which is fatty fish, but if you're vegan, try it with flax seeds. Super anti-inflammatory. Like you can't even play an anti-inflammatory game if omega-3s are not on board. They basically metabolize the fats into these compounds that decrease the production of chemicals that promote inflammation. Then we have zinc, super essential nutrient, and it's a star player in maintaining the gut barrier. So you want to get that in there. And A and D, vitamin A and D, first of all, you just need A and D for like everything, but it's also an integral role in the heal and seal process of your lining. And then we rebalance or sometimes reintroduce. Rebalance means we start fixing everything else, right? We got to make sure our sleep is on point, make sure our movement's on point. But it's also time for reintroduction, where we slowly reintroduce foods and see how we react to it. We have to start with the gut, right? We have to figure out what's happening. The 5R protocol, you have to optimize your nutrition because what you put on your plate determines how your body responds to inflammation, right? You want to eat the rainbow. When your fruits and your veggies have color, that color is called a phytonutrient. It's literally nature's medicine, and it plays a huge role in reducing inflammation. Right? For example, red foods like tomatoes and strawberries contain lycopene, which is an antioxidant, combats inflammation. Green veggies like spinach and kale has vitamin K, which is known to suppress inflammatory markers. Orange and yellow foods like carrots and oranges give you vitamin C and beta-carotene, again, essential for strong immune system. The blue and purple foods like blueberries, eggplants, packed with anthocyanins, right, which are antioxidants, and they have been known to reduce inflammatory signals. So you see how the colors of the food are actually the supplements that you're buying in a bottle. So the more colorful your plate, the more nutrients you get to fight inflammation. It's not just visually appealing, but it also is scientifically backed to mitigate chronic inflammation. Now, we said that we have other sources of inflammation. That's our gut, that's our nutrition. But what about our hormonal imbalance, right? So I always look at thyroid first, because there's no point in talking about your sex hormones if your thyroid's out of whack. Your thyroid has to be on point. It's like top dog, okay? So you have to fix that. Then you have to make sure insulin's on point. There's no insulin resistance. You got to fix that. And then you take a look at sex hormones, because a lot of times the sex hormones will normalize or calm down a little bit once you fix these two. And sometimes you actually need to replace them. And that's okay. But I like to replace the hormones after we make sure that thyroid and insulin are on point. But you have to balance them. If you have adrenal fatigue, you got to work on that, right? You have to figure out what's going on. Now, we can't eliminate stress. We can work on managing it, relaxation techniques. If you have adrenal fatigue, you have to learn how to manage it. It's really not an option. Everyone's a little bit, everyone has ways to do it, but you have to do it. And then you're going to test for those additional causes I told you about, right? You fix your nutrition, your hormones are balanced, you manage your adrenal fatigue. Only then, if you're not feeling well, you would jump into Lyme or mold. Okay, don't jump into it at first, because if your belly's not on point, your thyroid's out of whack, you won't even be able to handle the Lyme and mold protocol, okay? So there is an order. There is a method. That's why I call it the new method. There is a method. And even on my membership, if you go on the membership or even my book, you'll see I'm constantly going step by step. You don't want to just throw everything at it, okay? So now let's talk about supplements, because everyone always asks about supplements. I already told you some of our supplements that for the gut, but before I give you that list again, I always need you to remember that supplements are supplemental, okay? They're just a side. They're not the main stars of the show. Like if you think you could eat the standard American diet and then take a handful of pills and make it work, it's not going to work out, okay? They fill in the gaps that sometimes we miss. So top picks for managing inflammation. Omega-3, I told you, you can't talk about anti-inflammatory if this isn't in your pill box. You're not even playing the game without omega-3. Next on our list is curcumin, which is the active compound in turmeric, which is a spice. It lowers inflammation. It relieves pain by blocking something called NF-kappa B. That's a molecule that's really in charge of inflammation, so it blocks that. You can use it as a spice on your food. You don't have to swallow a pill. Resveratrol, it's a super powerful antioxidant. I take it in liquid form. You can add it to your smoothie. We've all heard about vitamin C. We know that vitamin C helps boost immunity, but it's also super anti-inflammatory. Okay, it wards off inflammation by clearing out free radicals. And something I haven't mentioned yet, ALA, alpha-lipoic acid. Alpha-lipoic acid is a fatty acid that occurs in our body, but it is amazing. It is both an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. So it's amazing to trying to get that in there as well. And before you run to the store, I said this before, just make sure that your nutrition and your gut and your lifestyle are on point, because they're doing most of the heavy lifting here. Okay, the supplements are sidekicks, but they're not going to save the day on their own. So a quick recap. Inflammation is the root cause of your disease. It's the root cause of your I-Don't-Feel-Good-Itis. And if you're only managing the disease with medication and not getting to the root cause, you're not going to get better. You're just not going to get better. You're just going to manage the symptoms. Inflammation is the silent driver of disease. So your goal should be finding the source of inflammation and removing it. Sometimes it's as simple as fixing your gut and your hormones. And sometimes you have to dig deeper for chronic infections or exposure to toxins, but take it slow and take it methodically. The bottom line is treat the cause of inflammation, and you can modulate all the diseases at the same time. Look forward to hearing your comments. I'm so happy that you're here. You are a game changer. You are changing the game of your health. And remember, I called it the new method because you always knew there was a better way. See you guys next week.